Did you know that China has the largest number of multi-millionaires in the world? It is estimated that every week 2 new multi-millionaires emerge in the country. But what if I told you that, at the same time, China also faces one of the highest rates of income inequality on the planet? Yes, China is widely recognized as one of the largest global economies, a true engine of growth that surprises the world with its technological and industrial advances. However, behind this facade of prosperity lies a much more complex and often dark reality. Want to know more? Then stick with us, because today we're going to take you to discover a side of China that rarely appears in the spotlight. Number 1. Poverty rates in China. In 1978, China was a sea of poverty. Imagine 800 million people living in squalor, without access to the basics. But like a sleeping dragon, the country awoke. With socialist policies and a lot of effort, China has drastically reduced extreme poverty. In 2013, there were 82 million. In 2019, only 6 million. And in 2020, extreme poverty was officially eradicated. Quite a victory, no? But, as with every success story, there is a catch. Yes, there's a part that China doesn't like to talk about or show off. China is an economic giant. No one doubts that. But behind the skyscrapers and cutting-edge technology, there is a reality that many people prefer to ignore: poverty. It's true that extreme poverty has decreased, but is that enough? Millions of Chinese still live on the bare minimum, struggling to make ends meet and provide for the basics, and inequality that's glaring. While some boast unimaginable fortunes, others barely have enough to eat. In rural areas, the situation is even more critical. Despite government efforts, poverty persists. And in big cities, life can be too expensive for those who earn little, and we're going to talk about that now. Number 2. Poverty reduction. It's true, China deserves plaudits for lifting millions out of extreme poverty. But, as the saying goes, not all that glitters is gold. Poverty reduction in China has been like a bullet train, fast, efficient, but it has left many people behind. The cities grew and prospered, while the countryside was left destitute, and poverty has reinvented itself. It's no longer enough to look at the extreme poverty line. Relative poverty, which compares people's income with the national average, shows a very different reality. Millions of Chinese still live on very little, without access to a decent life. And who are these forgotten people of the Chinese economic miracle? Rural dwellers, the elderly, ethnic minorities. The list is long and sad. There are plenty of examples of this reality. In March, the Cyberspace Administration of China, the country's powerful internet regulator, announced an offensive against anyone who publishes videos or posts that deliberately manipulate sadness, incite polarization, create information harmful to the image of the party and government, or hinder economic and social development. In other words, videos showing the harsh reality of the elderly, disabled, and children living in poverty were banned. One emblematic case was that of an elderly woman who lived on just $15 a month. Her moving story, which circulated on social media, was quickly deleted. Censorship even extended to posts highlighting poverty and inequality in the country. After all, for the Chinese government, exposing this face of reality could tarnish the image of a nation that seeks to be seen as prosperous and invincible in the eyes of the world. Another case that shocked the public but survived outside Chinese censorship on YouTube involved a journalist interviewing a 78-year-old widow on a street in Chengdu, in southwest China. The woman, her voice trembling, said that she lived on so little that she could only afford rice, the only food that fit into her budget. She hadn't eaten meat for so long that she could barely remember what it tasted like. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke about the financial difficulties she faced on a daily basis. During the interview, the journalist accompanied her to a grocery store. Together, they bought rice, eggs, pork, and flour, basic items that amounted to 127 yuan, about $15. When the bill was presented, the journalist insisted on paying it. Visibly moved, he said goodbye to the woman with a heavy heart, letting the impact that the story had had on him shine through. However, the impact of this video on the Chinese internet was quickly halted. The content was removed from the two largest user-generated video platforms in China, and the journalist's accounts were suspended. Once again, the reality of poor people has been silenced, hidden from public view, in the name of maintaining a prosperous image that the Chinese government wants to project to the world. China may have won the battle against extreme poverty, but the war against inequality is far from over. And that's what we're going to talk about now. Number 3. Social inequality, a structural problem. Social inequality in China is a deep-rooted structural problem. Although the country has achieved unprecedented economic growth, the benefits of this growth have not been distributed equitably. The gap between rich and poor continues to widen, fueled by a combination of factors, including economic policies that favor urban areas and elites. This social inequality is evident in various aspects of daily life, from access to education and health to employment opportunities. While urban elites enjoy a quality of life comparable to that of developed countries, many Chinese, especially in rural areas, live in poverty. In a nutshell, China has grown, it has become rich, but not everyone is taking advantage of this wealth. It's as if the cake is growing, but only a few have the chance to eat a piece, which brings us to another problem, what we call multidimensional poverty. Number 4. Multidimensional poverty. Challenges on several fronts. Poverty in China is not just a question of income, and you know why this is called multidimensional poverty. The poorest face challenges in several dimensions, including limited access to quality education, poor healthcare, and long commutes to access basic services. In rural areas, for example, schools often lack resources and qualified teachers, resulting in poorer quality education. This perpetuates the cycle of poverty, as children who grow up in these conditions are less likely to achieve upward social mobility. In addition, the lack of access to quality health services means that treatable illnesses can have devastating consequences for the poor, both in terms of health and finances. Number 5. Insufficient pensions. And when it comes to inequality, we need to talk about them. The elderly. Imagine working all your life and when you reach old age, not having enough to live with dignity. This is the reality for many elderly people in China. The flawed pension system leaves the poorest on the edge of the abyss. The social security system in China leaves a lot to be desired. Many rural workers never had the chance to contribute to a retirement fund and now depend on their children to help them survive. And if the family is also poor, then the situation gets even more complicated. In 2021, a government report revealed an alarming reality. The elderly in the countryside received an average of only $27 a month. To give you an idea of the disparity, this amount corresponds to just 5% of what the average urban pensioner receives. It's a glaring difference that highlights the inequality between the countryside and the city. In the cities, although pensions are a little more generous, they are still far from enough to cover the high cost of living. Many urban elderly face the harsh reality of having to keep working, even when their health no longer allows it, just to make ends meet and maintain a minimally dignified life. Old age in China should be a time of rest and tranquility, but for many it is synonymous with struggle and uncertainty. Number 6. How the one-child policy harmed the poor. Remember when we talked about how difficult it is for the elderly to rely on their children for support? Well, this situation has become even more complicated because of the one-child policy. The one-child policy, implemented in China in 1979, was an attempt to control population growth. But like any radical policy, it had unexpected and often tragic consequences. For poor families, having many children was a survival strategy. Children helped with the work, took care of their parents in old age. But with the one-child policy, this support network has been destroyed. In addition, the policy exacerbated gender inequalities, with many couples preferring to have male children, which resulted in a gender imbalance and the abandonment of girls, especially in rural areas. This has created a generation of men who struggled to find wives, increasing social and economic tensions in these regions. For families who couldn't afford to pay the fines for violating the policy, the economic consequences were severe, perpetuating the cycle of poverty. Number 7. High cost of living in big cities. Although China's big cities, such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, are centers of wealth and prosperity, the high cost of living in these areas is a major obstacle for the poor. China's big cities, with their skyscrapers and bright lights, can seem like a paradise of opportunity. But for the poor, the reality is quite different. The cost of living in China's metropolises is sky high, and many can barely afford to pay the rent. Imagine having to choose between eating or having a roof over your head. This is the sad reality of many families who move to the cities in search of a better life. Property prices are absurd, and even a tiny room can cost a fortune. And it's not just housing that weighs on the pocket. Food, transportation, health, everything is more expensive in big cities. For the poor, every penny counts, and the struggle for survival is daily. Number 8. Accelerated urbanization, expensive housing, and poor conditions. And this quest for a better life in the cities comes at a high price. China has urbanized in record time, but this rapid change has had serious consequences, especially for the poorest. Millions have left the countryside in search of a better life in the cities, but this mass migration has brought with it a serious problem: homelessness. With so many people arriving, property prices have exploded, and those who can't afford it, they end up living in precarious conditions without access to drinking water, basic sanitation, or electricity. Although the government has promised improvements, the reality for many is a life of housing insecurity and inhumane living conditions. Which brings us to our next topic. Number 9. Lack of access to energy, internet, and basic sanitation in rural areas. Despite technological and infrastructural advances in China's urban areas, many rural regions still lack access to basic services such as electricity, internet, and sanitation. This lack of access exacerbates the situation of poverty, further isolating these communities and limiting their opportunities for development. Although rural electrification has advanced, it is still far from universal. Without access to electricity, many families rely on traditional and less efficient methods to cook and heat their homes, which can affect their health and quality of life. In addition, the lack of internet access limits educational and economic opportunities, especially in an increasingly digital age. Number 10. Food security. China may have won the battle against extreme hunger, but the war against food insecurity is still far from won. The inequality so present in Chinese society also manifests itself at the table. While some indulge in sumptuous banquets, others struggle to guarantee the basics. In rural areas, the situation is even more critical. Pollution and low agricultural productivity create a vicious cycle of difficulties for those who depend on the land to survive. Many families face the harsh reality of food insecurity, eating little and poorly, without access to a balanced and nutritious diet. Extreme hunger may be a rarity, but food insecurity haunts millions of Chinese people. The lack of access to quality food compromises the health and well-being of countless families, perpetuating a cycle of poverty and vulnerability. Number 11. Life expectancy. And as if food insecurity weren't enough, another alarming fact about poverty in China is the low life expectancy in certain regions. Longevity in the country varies greatly depending on the region and economic condition. In urban areas with more resources, people live almost as long as in developed countries. But in poorer rural areas, the situation is quite different, with a much lower life expectancy. This difference shows how inequality affects access to health, food, and other important factors for living longer. In addition, the quality of life of older people in rural areas is often compromised by a lack of access to health services and social support. Without an adequate safety net, many elderly people in poverty face daily challenges, which contributes to a shorter and more difficult life. Number 12. Poverty in rural China. Rural poverty in China remains one of the most complex and difficult problems to solve. Despite advances in the fight against poverty in cities, the reality in rural China is still marked by challenges and difficulties. Rural poverty persists as an open wound, requiring urgent attention and solutions. The lack of basic infrastructure, such as roads, schools, and hospitals, makes life difficult for those who live far from major centers. Access to quality public services is limited, and opportunities for employment and economic development are scarce. In addition, the rural population faces specific problems, such as environmental degradation, which affects agricultural productivity and the livelihoods of many families. The migration of young people in search of better conditions in the cities also exacerbates the situation, leaving behind an aging population with less capacity to work. Number 13. Migration out of China. And speaking of migration, for some poor Chinese, migration outside the country is seen as an alternative to escaping poverty. Although China has made great economic advances, many still see better opportunities in other countries, especially in neighboring nations or in the West. However, this migration often comes with its own challenges. Migrants can face discrimination, exploitation, and poor working conditions in their new countries of residence. In addition, leaving China means moving away from family and cultural support networks, which can exacerbate isolation and vulnerability. In short, China deserves applause, yes, but we need to find a way to share the cake more fairly so that everyone can have a decent life. But what about you? Did you know this other side of China? Did you get an idea of how this country is full of contrasts and surprises? Leave your opinion in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with your friends so that they too can discover this and other incredible curiosities about our bello mundo. Thank you very much for watching and see you on your next adventure.